The sun hung low over the California hills, casting a warm glow across the sprawling vineyard estate where the reunion was being held. Rows of grapevines stretched endlessly in neat green lines, their shadows falling long in the late afternoon. The air smelled of grilled food and wild lavender, carried in by a soft breeze that seemed to hum with laughter and voices. Families had traveled from across the state, and even from as far as Oregon and Nevada, to gather here, a tradition that had been passed down for 3 generations. This year was special. It was the first time in nearly a decade that so many relatives had agreed to meet in one place. Marion, a woman in her late 60s, stood near the edge of the patio, quietly observing. Her silver hair shimmered faintly in the sunlight, styled neatly as always, and her linen dress swayed gently in the breeze. She wasn't a woman who liked the spotlight, but reunions like this had always mattered to her. They were, in her mind, a reminder that family was supposed to mean something, that no matter how far people scattered, blood carried them back together again. Her husband, Richard, stood across the lawn, talking animatedly with a cluster of relatives. His deep voice rose above the noise, full of charm, drawing laughter from the group around him. Marion smiled faintly at the sight, though there was something about the way he carried himself that seemed different. She had been married to him for 42 years, long enough to read his body language without effort. His gestures seemed rehearsed, his smile just a little too wide, his eyes darting around as though searching for someone. She brushed the thought away and forced herself to focus on the moment. Cousins she hadn't seen in years were hugging one another. Children were racing between the picnic tables, and the scent of barbecue hung thick in the air. Someone's old record player crackled to life, spilling out soft jazz that mixed with the hum of chatter. Marion's cousin Lillian approached then, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. She was only a year younger than Marion, but had always been the more flamboyant one. Her blonde hair was perfectly curled, her jewelry glinting in the sun. People often described her as magnetic, though Marion sometimes thought of her as a storm, exciting from a distance, exhausting up close. "Marion!" Lillian exclaimed, her voice bright. She handed over 1 glass. "Can you believe this turnout? It feels like a wedding." Marion chuckled softly and accepted the drink. "It does. I never thought we'd get everyone together like this again." "Well, California has its charms," Lillian said with a wink, taking a slow sip. Her eyes flicked across the yard, lingering, Marion noticed, in the same direction Richard was standing. It was a fleeting glance, gone before Marion could process it. She dismissed it, thinking it was just her imagination. The evening unfolded in bursts of laughter, clinking glasses and family photos. Marion moved gracefully through the groups, greeting nieces, nephews, and distant cousins. She listened as younger relatives told her about new jobs, college acceptances, and upcoming weddings. For a while, she allowed herself to feel a kind of peace, but every now and then, she'd glance across the lawn and catch Richard staring at his phone, his brows furrowed in concentration. At one point, he excused himself from a conversation, slipping away toward the vineyard. Marion watched him go, the unease stirring again in her chest. By the time he returned, his face was flushed, his shirt slightly rumpled, and he laughed too loudly as he rejoined the group. Lillian, she noticed, had vanished during the same stretch of time. The coincidence pricked at her like a thorn, but she told herself not to be paranoid. This was a reunion, a place for joy, not suspicion. As night fell, fairy lights flickered on across the patio, bathing everything in a warm glow. Children roasted marshmallows over the fire pit, while the adults swapped old stories. Richard wrapped an arm loosely around Marion's shoulders, his cologne faint but familiar. To anyone watching, they looked like the picture of long-married comfort. Yet Marion felt the weight of something unspoken pressing down on her. She noticed how his grip was looser than usual, how his eyes flicked away quickly when she tried to meet them. A part of her wanted to push the thought aside and savor the night. Another part, the part that had carried her through decades of loyalty, sacrifice, and patience, told her to stay vigilant. She smiled at the laughter around her, but inside a storm was quietly beginning. The next morning dawned crisp and golden, the California sun spilling through the tall sycamores that lined the property. Birds chirped overhead, and the estate seemed almost enchanted in its serenity. Families bustled about preparing breakfast, Children carried plates, aunts arranged platters of fruit, and the smell of fresh coffee drifted across the lawn. Marian moved quietly among them, greeting relatives with a soft smile. She had always been a calm presence, the kind of woman others leaned on when chaos broke out. Today, though, her heart felt heavier. She told herself it was simply the fatigue of travel, but deep inside she knew it was more than that. Richard's strange behavior from the night before still lingered in her thoughts like a shadow she couldn't shake. Across the patio, Richard sat at a table with Lillian. The two leaned close together, their heads tilted in a way that seemed far too intimate for casual conversation. They laughed at something on his phone, their shoulders brushing. Marian stopped mid-step, her stomach tightening. She told herself she was being foolish. Cousins and in-laws were bound to share moments of familiarity, but there was something in the way Richard's eyes softened when he looked at Lillian that made her skin prickle. "Good morning, Marian," a voice broke through her thoughts. It was her niece, Clara, balancing a tray of muffins. "Did you sleep well?" Marian forced a smile. "As well as one can in a noisy house." Clara laughed, oblivious to the storm stirring behind Marian's calm eyes. She continued on, and Marian turned back toward Richard. By then, Lillian had leaned back, tossing her blonde curls over her shoulder, her laughter ringing across the patio. Richard's grin was wide, too wide. Throughout the day, little moments stacked one upon the other like bricks forming a wall of suspicion. During the family volleyball game, Richard volunteered to partner with Lillian, even though he usually avoided such activities. Marian watched from her chair as the two of them moved in unison, exchanging playful shoves and celebratory high-fives that lingered a little too long. Later, while everyone gathered for a scenic walk through the vineyards, Marian noticed Richard falling behind the group. When she glanced back, she caught him whispering something to Lillian, who responded with a coy smile. The two quickly rejoined the others, pretending nothing had happened. Marian's chest tightened. Every instinct screamed at her to confront them, to demand an explanation. Yet decades of keeping peace had trained her otherwise. She had learned to swallow her anger, to keep her dignity by not making a scene. She told herself that perhaps it was harmless, just two people caught up in the lightness of the reunion, but the knot in her stomach only grew tighter. That evening, the family gathered for dinner under a canopy of twinkling lights. Long tables were arranged with candles, platters of roasted meats, and bowls of salads fresh from the garden. Children ran between the tables while adults lifted glasses and toasts. Marion sat beside Richard, but his attention kept drifting. His phone buzzed twice during the meal, and each time he excused himself briefly. When he returned, his shirt was slightly wrinkled, his expression strained before he quickly masked it with a grin. "Everything all right?" Marian asked quietly, her eyes searching his face. He paused for only a second before answering, "Just work emails." "Nothing important." He kissed her cheek, a gesture that felt oddly mechanical, and turned back to join a story one of the uncles was telling. Marian's hands trembled beneath the table. Work emails at a family reunion? Richard had always been proud of his ability to switch off when it came to these events. Something wasn't right. Across the table, Lillian caught Marian's gaze. Her cousin's smile was quick, almost smug, before she turned her attention back to her plate. It was such a fleeting look that Marian wondered if she had imagined it, but the way her chest burned told her otherwise. Later, after dinner, as the family migrated toward the fire pit for marshmallows and music, Marian slipped away to the edge of the vineyard. She needed air, space, clarity. She replayed the entire day in her mind. Richard's laughter, the brushing of shoulders, the stolen glances. Every memory cut deeper than the last. "Don't be paranoid," she whispered to herself, staring at the rows of grapevines glowing under the moonlight. "Not here, not now." And yet, as she turned back toward the patio, she caught sight of Richard and Lillian once more. They stood at the edge of the group, their faces close, his hand brushing hers as if by accident. Their laughter melted into the night, and Marian felt the ground beneath her steady feet begin to shift. This was no longer her imagination. Something was happening, something that could unravel everything she had believed about her marriage and her family. By the third day of the reunion, the vineyard estate had settled into a rhythm. Mornings began with breakfast on the patio, afternoons with games or scenic hikes, and evenings with long dinners that stretched into laughter-filled nights. To everyone else, it was bliss. To Marian, it was a performance, one where she found herself both participant and unwilling spectator. She had become hyper-aware of Richard's movements, the way he leaned just a little too close when Lillian spoke, the quick flicker of his eyes when someone asked where she was, the sudden hush that seemed to fall over their voices whenever Marian appeared. Each incident, small on its own, stacked together until they formed a picture she could no longer ignore. That afternoon, while the family gathered for a backyard barbecue, Marian excused herself to fetch another pitcher of lemonade. The kitchen windows overlooked the patio, and as she poured, she noticed Richard and Lillian slip away toward the side of the house. Her breath caught. She moved quietly to the open window, the murmur of their voices threading through the warm summer air. "We have to be careful," she heard Richard say, his voice low but urgent. "I know," Lillian whispered, followed by a soft laugh that made Marian's skin crawl. "But no one suspects a thing. Not with all this chaos around us." Marian's hand tightened around the glass pitcher until she thought it might crack. She froze, straining to hear more. Richard's voice dropped even lower, almost inaudible. "Last night was risky, but worth it." Marian's heart pounded in her chest. The words cut sharper than any knife, slicing through the fragile threads of denial she had been holding on to. She wanted to storm outside, to scream, to drag them into the light of day in front of the entire family. But something stopped her. Pride, dignity, strategy. She wouldn't hand them the satisfaction of watching her crumble. Instead, she placed the pitcher down with trembling hands and forced herself to walk calmly back toward the patio. When she returned, Richard and Lillian were already seated again, laughing with two of the younger cousins as though nothing had happened. Their masks were flawless. Hers, she realized, would have to be stronger. Throughout the evening, Marian moved like a shadow, watching, listening, waiting. Twice she caught Richard leaving the fire pit only to return minutes later, with Lillian following shortly after. Each time they returned separately, but their flushed faces and too bright smiles betrayed them. Later, as the fire burned low and most of the family drifted off to bed, Marian lingered on the patio, sipping tea. From where she sat, she could hear faint voices drifting from the far corner of the vineyard. Richard's laugh carried in the wind, followed by Lillian's. She rose quietly, her slippers barely making a sound against the flagstone. She moved closer, careful to stay in the shadows. The two of them stood beneath the vines, silhouettes against the moonlight. "I wish we had more time," Lillian said softly, her voice tinged with something almost tender. Richard reached out, brushing her arm. "We'll find time. We always do." Marian's breath caught in her throat. She pressed a hand to her chest, steadying herself. Her eyes burned with unshed tears, but her mind was already shifting. This wasn't suspicion anymore. This was confirmation. She stepped back into the shadows before they could see her. Retreating to her room, she closed the door quietly and sat at the edge of the bed. Her reflection stared back at her from the mirror. A woman who had built her life on loyalty, who had carried her family through struggles, who had trusted her husband without question. And now she realized she was the one being laughed at behind her back. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message from her daughter who hadn't been able to make it to the reunion. "How's everything going, Mom? Having fun?" Marian stared at the screen, her fingers hovering over the keys. She wanted to pour out the truth, to let someone, anyone, share the burden, but she typed only, "It's nice. Busy, but nice. I'll tell you more later." When she set the phone down, her resolve hardened. This wasn't just about Richard's betrayal. It wasn't just about Lillian's cruelty. This was about her dignity, her voice, her right to not be humiliated quietly in the corner. For now, she would wait. She would listen. She would let them believe she was blind, because the moment would come, and when it did, she would make sure they never forgot it. The reunion estate was quiet that night, the echoes of laughter replaced by the steady chirp of crickets and the occasional rustle of wind through the vines. Most of the family had gone to bed, leaving only a few cousins lingering by the fire pit. Marian lay awake in her room, staring at the ceiling, the shadows cast by the lamp flickering across the walls. Sleep was impossible. Every whisper, every stolen glance between Richard and Lillian replayed in her mind like a cruel film. She tried to tell herself she was imagining it, that her heart was exaggerating what her eyes had seen, But the conversation she overheard earlier left no room for doubt. Something was happening between them. Something she couldn't unhear, couldn't ignore. When Richard's side of the bed remained empty longer than usual, her chest tightened. He had excused himself half an hour ago, claiming he needed air. Marian sat up slowly, her pulse racing. She slipped on her robe and padded quietly across the hardwood floor, her slippered feet barely making a sound. The hallway was dim, lit only by a lamp left on at the far end. She moved through the house like a shadow, careful not to disturb anyone. From the patio, she spotted movement near the vineyard rows. Two figures, walking side by side, their bodies close enough to brush. Her throat went dry. Gripping the railing for balance, Marian slipped outside. The cool night air hit her face, but she barely felt it. Every step toward the vines felt heavy, her heart pounding so loudly she feared they might hear her coming. She kept her distance, using the shadows as cover, until she was close enough to see them clearly. Richard and Lillian stood beneath the vines, the moonlight painting their faces in silver. Richard's hand rested at the small of Lillian's back, his thumb moving in small circles. Lillian leaned into him, her voice a whisper Marian could just make out. "I can't believe we're sneaking around like teenagers." Richard chuckled softly. "Maybe that's what makes it exciting." Then he kissed her. Marian froze, her body rigid, the air sucked from her lungs. It wasn't just a fleeting kiss. It was slow, deliberate, full of the kind of intimacy that spoke of more than a moment. It spoke of history, of nights before this one. Her hand flew to her mouth to stifle a gasp. Her vision blurred as tears welled up, hot and relentless. The man she had built her life with, the man she had trusted with her youth, her loyalty, her very identity, was here betraying her with her own blood. Her cousin. Her knees trembled, and for a moment she thought she might collapse. But something inside her, something deeper than pain, pushed her to stay silent. She forced her breathing steady and stepped back into the shadows. Her instincts screamed to confront them, to shout, to let her rage spill into the night. But another voice, calmer, sharper, told her no, not yet. She pulled her phone from her pocket, her hands shaking so violently she almost dropped it. With trembling fingers, she lifted it and pressed record. The camera zoomed in enough to capture their embrace, their whispered laughter, the damning kiss. She recorded until her storage threatened to run out, then lowered the phone and pressed it against her chest. Proof. Proof she could not be gaslit out of. Proof they could not deny. She backed away slowly, her body moving on instinct, her heart breaking with every step. When she finally reached her room, she locked the door and sat on the edge of the bed. The sobs came. Then, violent, uncontrollable, shaking her entire body. She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders trembling as decades of loyalty and sacrifice came crashing down around her. When her tears finally subsided, what remained was not just grief, but resolve. She stared at her reflection in the mirror, the same woman from the night before, but changed. Her face was pale, her eyes red, but behind them burned something fierce. Richard thought she would stay quiet. Lillian thought she would swallow her humiliation. They believed she would play the role of the dutiful wife, the docile cousin, the woman too afraid to make a scene. They were wrong. Marian placed her phone on the nightstand, the evidence safe and undeniable. She whispered to herself, her voice hoarse but steady, "Tomorrow I end this." And for the first time in days, she felt a strange calm settle over her. The storm was still raging, but now it was hers to control. Morning came with golden light spilling through the curtains, far too bright for the heaviness that clung to Marian's chest. She had hardly slept. Each time she closed her eyes, the image returned. Richard's hand on Lillian's back, the slow kiss beneath the vineyard's moonlight. It played like a cruel loop in her mind, leaving her both sickened and strangely calm. She dressed carefully, her movements mechanical, as though each button of her blouse was a small armor plate she was fastening into place. When she looked in the mirror, she almost didn't recognize the woman staring back at her. Her eyes were rimmed with exhaustion, yet underneath burned a quiet fury that she had never seen before. She touched her cheek gently, as if to remind herself she was still here, still standing. The smell of bacon and pancakes drifted through the house as she walked toward the patio. Dozens of relatives were already gathered around the long breakfast tables, laughter rising above the clinking of cutlery. To anyone else, it was another cheerful reunion morning. To Marian, the sound was hollow. Richard sat near the center of the table, his voice booming as he entertained a small crowd. He glanced up as Marian approached, his smile quick and practiced, as though nothing had happened. Next to him sat Lillian, her golden hair catching the morning light. She reached for a carafe of orange juice, her sleeve brushing Richard's arm in a way that seemed too casual to be an accident. Marian's stomach twisted. She took her seat at the far end, trying to focus on the chatter around her. A younger cousin was showing off photos from a recent trip to Europe. An uncle was telling the same story he always told at reunions, earning groans and laughter. For a few minutes, Marian almost managed to slip into the rhythm. Then Lillian's voice rang out across the table. "You know, loyalty is such an underrated trait these days," she said, smiling sweetly. "Some people can't help but wander, but others," her eyes flicked, deliberately toward Richard, "know how to keep things exciting." The table chuckled politely, not catching the edge hidden in her words. Richard smirked, raising his glass as if in agreement. Marian froze, her fork clattering softly against her plate. Her face burned, not from shame but from the sharp sting of humiliation. Lillian wasn't just betraying her in secret. She was mocking her in plain sight, cloaking cruelty in playful words. A cousin across the table noticed Marian's silence. "Are you all right, Marian? You're awfully quiet this morning." She forced a small smile. "I'm fine, just taking it all in." But inside, her resolve solidified like steel. She wouldn't sit in silence while her cousin smirked and her husband basked in stolen intimacy. Not anymore. She placed her napkin gently on the table and excused herself, slipping away before the tears could come. In the quiet of her room, she paced like a caged animal, her hands trembling. She thought of the years she had given Richard, decades of standing by his side, raising children, weathering storms, building a life brick by brick. She thought of the trust she had placed in family, in blood, and she thought of how they had thrown it back at her with smirks and whispers. Her phone lay on the dresser, the evidence from last night still safe within it. She picked it up, replaying the video with shaking hands. Richard's voice, Lillian's laughter, the kiss. It was all there. Proof that she hadn't imagined it, proof that they couldn't deny. The humiliation from breakfast still echoed in her ears. Some people can't help but wander. The words stung, but they also gave her clarity. She could not, would not, let this pass in silence. That evening, the family would gather for the reunion's main event, a dinner with speeches, music, and photos meant to honor the legacy of their parents and grandparents. Marian had been asked to say a few words, a simple toast. She had planned to keep it light, full of gratitude, but now her speech would serve a different purpose. She rehearsed it in her mind, her voice steady even as her hands shook. She would not scream. She would not cry. She would stand tall, speak the truth, and let them unravel themselves in front of everyone. By the time she left her room, her face was calm, her posture composed. No one watching would suspect the storm raging beneath her surface. And that, she thought with grim satisfaction, was exactly how it should be. For the rest of the day, she moved like a ghost among the family, smiling, nodding, answering questions politely. Inside, she counted the hours, because tonight, under the glow of string lights and clinking glasses, the truth would finally come out. Evening arrived like a stage curtain rising. The vineyard was lit with strings of golden lights draped overhead, their glow reflected in the wine glasses lined neatly along the tables. A hired band played soft music in the background, and the air was alive with chatter and laughter. It was the highlight of the reunion, the event everyone had been anticipating, a night of toasts, photographs, and shared stories to celebrate the family's enduring bond. Marian sat at her table, her posture perfectly straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. To anyone watching, she appeared calm, serene even, but inside her chest, her heart pounded with a force that shook her entire body. The phone in her purse pressed against her side like a weapon, its recorded evidence ready for battle. Richard sat 2 seats away, his laughter booming, his glass raised as he charmed the cousins. Lillian was across from him, her hand resting on the table, her eyes flicking toward him more often than coincidence would allow. Marian watched them with the cold precision of a hawk circling prey. She thought about the morning, about Lillian's mocking remark and Richard's smug smile. The humiliation had burned like acid, but tonight it would be returned in kind. The host of the evening, one of the older uncles, tapped his glass for silence. Now, he announced cheerfully, as part of tradition, we'll invite a few family members to share some words. Stories, memories, gratitude, whatever your heart desires. There was applause, laughter, a few jokes from the crowd. Marian's name was called. She rose slowly, smoothing her dress, her movements deliberate. Every step to the front of the patio felt like a march, but her voice, when it came, was steady. "Good evening," she began, her eyes sweeping the crowd. "I want to thank everyone for being here. It's not easy to gather so many branches of one family tree, but tonight, looking around this vineyard, I feel the weight of legacy, of promises made to one another, of loyalty." A murmur of agreement rippled through the tables. Marian's tone was warm, sincere, but beneath it ran a current so sharp it could cut glass. "Loyalty," she repeated, her gaze lingering on Richard, then shifting deliberately to Lillian. "It's something we often take for granted. We assume it's there, woven into marriage vows, sealed in blood between family members. But sometimes," she paused, the silence heavy, "sometimes we find out that loyalty is a mask, and behind it lies betrayal and deceit." The air grew taut, the murmurs quieting. Several relatives leaned forward, sensing the shift. Richard stiffened in his chair, his smile faltering. Lillian's hand twitched against her wineglass. Marian reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. Her hand was steady now, her resolve unshakable. With a few taps, she projected the video onto the portable screen set up for the evening slideshow, a feature meant for family photos. Instead of smiling faces, the screen flickered to life with a grainy but undeniable image. Richard and Lillian, beneath the vines, locked in a kiss. A collective gasp swept the patio. Glasses clinked as people dropped them in shock. Whispers erupted, sharp and frantic. Someone covered their mouth with their hand. Children stared in confusion, quickly ushered away by parents. Richard shot to his feet. "Marian, this isn't what it looks like." But the proof was already there. The recording played again, the audio carrying through the speakers. Lillian's laugh, Richard's words. "Maybe that's what makes it exciting." The sound was like a thunderclap across the patio. Lillian's face drained of color. She clutched at her necklace, stammering, It was a mistake. It meant nothing." Marian's voice cut through the chaos, calm but searing. "It meant enough for you to sneak away in the middle of the night. It meant enough for you to mock me at my own family's table this morning. And it meant enough for you, Richard, to look me in the eye and lie while you defiled not just our marriage, but the very idea of family we're meant to honor here." Silence fell. The band had stopped playing. Even the crickets seemed muted. Dozens of eyes darted between Marian, Richard, and Lillian, the tension heavy enough to suffocate. Richard's mouth opened and closed, words failing him. For the first time in decades, Marian saw him stripped of all his charm, all his bravado. He was just a man caught, cornered, exposed. Lillian pushed back from the table, her chair scraping loudly against the patio stones. She muttered something under her breath and stormed away, her heels clacking against the flagstone, disappearing into the shadows of the vineyard. Marian straightened her shoulders, her voice softer now but steady. "Family deserves truth. Tonight you all deserve to see it. I won't live in silence, and I won't live in shame that doesn't belong to me." For a long moment no one moved. Then slowly a cousin rose to her feet and began to clap. Another joined, and another. Soon half the patio erupted into applause, not the cheerful kind from earlier, but a raw, fierce show of respect. Marian's eyes glistened, but she did not cry. She stood there, framed in the golden glow of the lights, a woman who had been betrayed and humiliated, but who had chosen truth over silence. Richard remained frozen in his chair, his hands gripping the table, his face ashen. For once, he had no audience to charm, no mask to wear, only the truth laid bare for all to see. The vineyard patio had never been so silent. After the applause tapered into uneasy murmurs, the air seemed charged, like the sky before a storm. Relatives shifted in their chairs, whispering behind their hands, their eyes darting between Marion, Richard, and the empty seat where Lillian had fled. Richard finally stood, his face pale, his voice shaky. "Marion, please, this isn't fair." But Marion didn't flinch. Her eyes locked on him, calm and unwavering. "Fair?" Her voice was steady, but the weight of it silenced even the whispers. "Was it fair when you made vows to me and broke them? Was it fair when you laughed at her jokes while she mocked me in front of everyone? Was it fair when you thought I wouldn't see you slipping away at night?" A heavy hush fell over the crowd. Richard's mouth opened, then closed, his usual eloquence reduced to stammers. For a man who had built his entire reputation on charm, he looked suddenly small. An older aunt leaned forward, her face twisted with anger. "With her own cousin, Richard? In this family?" Her words sliced through the air like glass shattering. Several cousins shook their heads in disgust. One muttered, "Unbelievable." Another, louder, "Shameful." Marion's nephew, a broad-shouldered man in his 40s, stood abruptly. "Aunt Marion, you don't deserve this. Not from him, not from her." His words carried the weight of the younger generation, and nods of agreement rippled through the crowd. Richard's hands gripped the back of his chair, his knuckles white. "You don't understand," he said hoarsely. "It just happened. We didn't mean—" Marion cut him off, her voice like a blade. "You didn't mean to? Or you didn't mean to get caught?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of shock across the patio. Richard had no answer. His face collapsed into shame, his shoulders slumping under the weight of truth. From the far side of the lawn, there was a sudden commotion. Lillian had returned, her face streaked with tears, her hair disheveled, her expression wild. She stormed back into the circle of lights, her voice rising. "This isn't all on me," she cried, pointing at Richard. "He came to me first. He was the one who said he felt trapped, that Marion didn't understand him anymore." Gasps erupted from the tables. Some turned their eyes toward Richard, others toward Marion. Marion's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, though it never reached her eyes. "So," she said, her tone icy calm, "not only betrayal, but cowardice too. Each blaming the other to escape the truth." Lillian faltered, her chest heaving. A cousin stood, shaking her head. "Lillian, you should leave. You've disgraced yourself, and you've disgraced us all." Tears streamed down Lillian's face as she turned and fled again, this time with no one following. The vineyard swallowed her into the dark. Richard remained standing, his gaze fixed on Marion, desperate now. "Please," he whispered, his voice raw, "we can work this out. Don't let this be how it ends." Marion looked at him for a long moment. Memories flashed before her eyes. Years of loyalty, the sacrifices she had made, the countless moments she had chosen silence to keep peace, and now the image of him kissing her cousin under the moonlight. Her answer came clear and strong. "It ended the moment you chose her." The words rang out like a verdict. Richard's shoulders sagged as though he had been struck. The family stirred, the spell breaking. Chairs scraped, voices rose. Cousins clustered around Marion, some hugging her, others whispering words of support. A few avoided Richard's gaze entirely, unable to look at him. The bond of respect he had once held in the family was gone, stripped away in one night. As the crowd swelled around her, Marion stood tall, her composure intact. She had not screamed. She had not wept before them. She had spoken the truth and left it to hang in the air like a judgment no one could deny. Richard tried once more, his voice cracking. "Marion, please, don't—" But she didn't turn back. For the first time in years, she walked away from him with her head high, surrounded by the warmth of family who had chosen her side. He remained alone in the glow of the string lights, a hollow figure among the ruins of his own making. The reunion ended the next morning, though the cheerful energy that had marked its beginning was gone. The patio was quieter, the air heavy with the memory of the night before. Families packed up their cars, children subdued, adults avoiding eye contact with Richard as they carried luggage to their trunks. Marian moved calmly through the motions of departure. She hugged nieces and nephews, accepted whispered words of support, and listened to cousins promise to call more often. Her face remained composed, her tone gentle. She was, as always, the steady one. But beneath that calm she carried a new strength, born not of silence this time, but of truth spoken aloud. Richard lingered at the edge of the driveway, his shoulders slumped, his suitcase at his feet. He tried to meet her eyes as she passed, but Marian kept walking, her gaze fixed forward. Whatever conversation he wanted, it was too late. She had given him decades. She would give him no more. When she reached her car, her nephew, who had stood up for her the night before, helped load her bags. "You did the right thing, Aunt Marian," he said softly. "It took courage to do what you did." She offered him a small smile. The truth always takes courage, but it was overdue. The drive home was long, the California hills rolling by in waves of gold and green. Marian kept the window cracked, letting the breeze wash over her. For the first time in years, she felt something that resembled freedom. Pain was still there, raw and sharp, but beneath it ran a current of relief. She no longer had to carry suspicion, no longer had to swallow humiliation. The secret was no longer hers to protect. It was theirs to live with. When she reached her home, she carried her bags inside, placed her purse on the table, and stood in the quiet of her living room. The silence felt different now, not heavy, but liberating. She poured herself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the world move outside. Her phone buzzed with messages, cousins checking in, friends offering support, even her daughter who had written, "Mom, I heard. I'm proud of you. You didn't let them break you." Marian's eyes softened. She wrote back simply, "I'm all right." Stronger even. In the weeks that followed, word spread through the extended family. Lillian's name was whispered with disdain, her once dazzling presence now tarnished. Invitations dwindled, support evaporated. She moved away quietly, ashamed, her reputation in tatters. Richard, too, found himself isolated. Friends who had once laughed at his jokes now kept their distance. At family gatherings, his absence was rarely mourned. He called Marian a handful of times, leaving voicemails filled with apologies, pleas, half-baked promises to change. She never returned a single call. The phone, once a tether to years of marriage, was now just another reminder of freedom she had reclaimed. Marian did not pretend it was easy. Nights were long, the bed was too big, the silence too deep. But when the grief threatened to swallow her, she reminded herself of the vineyard lights, of the moment she had stood in front of everyone and refused to let herself be shamed.
And that wraps up today's story. Now we want to hear from you. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments, and let's see how far these stories reach. If this story moved you or gave you chills, give it a like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories. One last thing, rate the story from 1 to 10 in the comments. Your feedback helps us bring you even better ones next time. Thanks for watching. We appreciate you being part of this storytelling journey.